Cheers. What have these two things got in common? Yeah, coffee. This has been painted in coffee. And in case you think I've lost the plot, the big advantage of painting with coffee is that it's really inexpensive and it lets us let go, have fun and experiment. And in the process we learn lots about tone and painting and textures. So I will share a few tips with you and a few do's and don'ts. My name's Liz Chadderton. I'm a professional watercolour artist based in Berkshire, and every week I bring you a tip, trick or technique I wish someone had told me about ages ago. And this week it's all about the joy of painting in coffee. Before we paint with the coffee, let's just check out what it's going to do with us. So I have a palette load of coffee here. I'll show you how I mix it in a second. But I'm going to start, and this is about the thickest I could manage to dissolve my coffee. So that's about the darkest I can manage. Nice colour. Then I've got a medium. It's a bit more liquid. A few less brush marks. The brush is definitely, when it's thick, it's almost like painting with Marmite. So there is a more medium one, and then I've got a slightly lighter one. Obviously I could go loads lighter still if I want to. So it's not the darkest I've ever seen, and once it starts getting down to this sort of lighter, then you get a far more smoother coverage. So that brings me on to how do layers work. If I use that light one and put a layer all the way over these 5 boxes, I'm going to let it dry. Then I'm going to put a second layer over 4 of the boxes, third layer over 3, etc., etc., and see how that colour builds up. So whether it's transparent and so forth, but I'm going to have to let that dry. So while it's drying, why don't I just show you what I'm actually using. And I found in the back of our cupboard some really, well, it's kind of gone a bit grey and yucky, so really out of date coffee, and that's what I'm using. My experience, instant coffee is the easiest to use. I've tried it with making proper ground coffee and then letting it evaporate so it gets thicker and thicker, making espresso. And do you know what? Actually, instant is just the best. So it literally a spoonful, and I use a bit of boiling water to dissolve it. It cools down ever so quickly, so you've no worry about sort of damaging your brushes, and then mix it in. And that's it, coffee paint ready. It's small, apart from that large lump, and it smells delicious. It smells really good in here, in fact. Let's just use that and show you a few cool effects you can do with it. So just a bit of film, and then you can place it in the wet coffee, and you can move it around until you get a pattern you like. Don't just plonk it on and leave it. If you've never used cling film with your watercolours, then I've got a whole film about that, so do have a look. I'm intrigued whether sprinkling salt into coffee would work. I was told that miners in Yorkshire always used to have salt in their coffee rather than sugar. So let's sprinkle in just some ordinary table salt and see what it does. Then I wanted to see how wet in wet works. So I'm using that medium mix, but I'm going to put in something a bit stronger. Okay, that doesn't work in the same way as you might expect it to with watercolour. You get a soft edge, but it doesn't whoosh out as you might expect. Well, that's okay, that's good to know. I'm using cold press watercolour paper. Definitely need to use proper watercolour paper, not, you know, printer paper or cartridge paper, because you're using a lot of water and it'll just buckle and sink in and be disgusting. So what I want to do here is just sprinkle in some raw coffee. So I've got the granules and I'm just sort of grinding it up with my fingers to get a powder. Obviously, if you've got powdered coffee, you don't need to do this. That's kind of cool. Might be a bit more dramatic if I'd used a thinner background coffee, but that's okay. Then I wanted to see how it works with a pen. I got my glass pen here and I'm going to use something fairly liquid. I'm just putting it on. Will it write? Yeah, it'll write on the glass pen. That was my medium coffee. I'm just wondering if my thick coffee might be too thick. If you saw my, yeah, it is actually. If you saw my film about glass pens, I found that when the ink was too thick or anything with glitter in, it just didn't flow down, and that's a bit the same here. So coffee ink needs to be pretty liquid and therefore is not ever going to be very dark. I really struggle with that dark. Oops. But this medium isn't too bad at all. I want to see in my final box here how easy it is to lift the coffee. Does it sink into the paper and stain, or is it easy to lift? I've got some kitchen towel. It's still wet. Okay, so you can lift quite nicely there if you wanted to make clouds in your coffee sky. I'm going to dry this and then see how easy it is to lift out of the dry coffee too. So I've dried this and you'll notice that it's a little shiny. Doesn't dry matte, sort of flat like watercolour does. Just using a wet brush and then going to dab away. And look, you can lift almost back to the white of the paper, so the coffee lifts incredibly easily, which is good to know. Which makes me suspicious, let me just check, yeah, that is dry, that layering is going to be tricky, so I'm going to have to use a very light hand, because if it lifts easily, that inevitably means that layering is going to be tricky without disturbing the underneath. Okay, so that's 2 layers and you can see that it's transparent, it's building up. I'll dry this and then we'll do layer number 3. Again, trying to use a really light hand. And it's interesting, what I've noticed as I'm doing this is that it's quite hard to tell when it's actually dry. Whoops. Because it's shiny. This over here looks like it's wet, but it isn't. It's just got a lot of shine on. So the more coffee it is, the shinier it is. This lighter shade isn't shiny because there isn't so much coffee in there. So that's worth remembering. Okay, layer 4, here we come. Here's layer 5. And now let's see how our cling film has worked. Yeah, some really nice patterns. And I find this surprising, but salt does work. I'm just scraping off the dry salt in coffee, salt and coffee. Fantastic. So we've learnt loads already. We can go dark, but only so dark. Yes, we can layer as long as we've got a nice light touch, When it's strong, we get a shiny finish. When it's quite dilute, we get a matte finish. Salt works, cling film works. Middle-ishy mix you can actually use in a pen. It lifts really easily. Yeah, wet in wet's not brilliant, but you know, that might be quite a nice effect. And sprinkling into a wet wash, really nice. Let's get painting. I thought dried autumn grasses would make a great subject, so I've wet the background here and then splattered in coffee. I'm grinding in pure coffee here, and I did put salt on. I'm throwing everything at this that I can think of, using that glass pen to pull out some spikes. Didn't work brilliantly, so then I'm using a rigger brush and some other brushes and putting in some made up sort of grasses, building up layers, rather like the dry brushing effect. Keep trying to use the light, medium and dark coffees, and decided a third teasel would be a good idea, so pop that in the front, and it's all still pretty wet. And then I'm using a finer brush and darker tones to build up detail, putting those lovely little wiggly wisp things and more spikes into the teasels. I found a mapping pen actually is rather good for getting quite dark lines, quite fine dark lines. So I was using that quite a bit along with my rigger, and just building up layers and having a play and seeing what sort of marks I can get. I mean, this picture isn't going to win any prizes, but it's just an idea of how we can use a strange sort of medium to learn. Here's the final little bits of detail, and then I'll take off the masking tape, which always helps because you just see it framed. Suddenly thought, oh, I haven't lifted, so I decided to lift some lights, and it was really easy to do, so the lifting technique is very, very useful. All in all, found it really pleasurable to work with, so I would encourage you to have a go at painting with your coffee rather than just drinking it.